connectionslab.org. Once again, Antonia is here. We are collaborating quite a bit nowadays on many things, and it's been just really amazing. It's nice to do the deep dive back into the psychology, back into the, this whole framing thing, which is maybe a little broader than we all have given it credit for. Maybe one of the things we're going to do tonight is really broaden things a bit. And so, in the past, we've always spoken about how our messaging is not really strategic. And we've not talked a whole lot about why that is and what we can do about it. But our messaging, generally, we don't think long-term. We're thinking about today, how do we win this election? And what ends up happening for our poor candidates, because we haven't done a good job of messaging as a party or as a movement, our candidates feel they have to make their messages palatable to more and more people, or worse, they feel that they have to not talk about who we really are, kind of suppress the things that we believe about ourselves. And none of that helps us. And it doesn't help the candidate either. It'll help candidates win. And I get that because we've all worked on campaigns, and that's probably why most of us are not running for office, because it's a whole lot of work. But if we have our messaging act together, it gets way easier for our candidates. So now I want you to think for a moment about what you watch. If you're watching MSNBC or even nightly news, most of the stories and almost all of the analysis is about how terrible the Republicans, about what terrible things they're doing, right? And what we don't seem to notice all the time is that this is by design. The GOP and Trump know that any publicity is good publicity. They don't care a whit about whether they're proven right or wrong about anything they say. For them, all that matters is setting the agenda. They want to get everyone talking about what they want us to talk about. And when we further their agenda by taking their bait and responding, we're wasting precious time not talking about our message. So we needlessly lose another battle in the messaging wars. So what we want to talk about tonight is changing that dynamic. Like a football or a basketball game, it's time for a turnover, as Antonia says. It's time for us to take the wheel and drive the messaging bus. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Antonia. She's got a jam-packed agenda for you, and it's going to be pretty cool. So we will also ask that in the interest of having enough time to do this, that if you have a question or a comment, keep it short. I know we're Democrats and we like to go on, but if you can avoid it, let's avoid that, and we'll keep it relatively crisp, as they say. Antonia Scatton, we've been buddies for a while. She has studied with George Lakoff, worked with him very intensely on things, and is the smartest person around here. Her and Hobie Stocking, smartest people I know in messaging. So go for it, Antonia.
Okay. So this is sort of a tricky topic because people talk about setting the agenda, but we don't really have a clear understanding of what the agenda sort of is and how it works. And so we get really focused on, okay, I am talking to a person. How do I convince the person I'm talking to think about what I think in the way that I want them to think? And the problem is that a huge portion of the public debate is actually more about, I'm talking to somebody and there's a third person over here picking up a little bit of what we're talking about, and it kind of gets out there into the ether, and that has an impact on what people are thinking. And so conservatives are actually doing things that strategically are designed to filter down through mass media, through the social media, and just kind of get out there. And so they understand that that what's being talked about is often more important than how we're talking about it. So I wanted to ask you a question. So who are Democrats currently winning or losing the public debate? So if you think Democrats are currently winning the public debate, I want you to raise your hand, and you can do that literally as opposed to the little symbol. Anybody think we're winning the public debate? Brian? No? Okay. So if you don't think, so who thinks we're losing the public debate? Ready? Yeah. So what topics are actually dominating the news? What is it, what would you say is like at the top of the agenda of the public debate? And you can type it in direct message, or you can just unmute yourself and say, right, so Trump, wokeness, yes.
I would say the whole issue with Justice Clarence Thomas too right now.
Yep, that's definitely in there.
Preserving
Right.
democracy.
I'm sorry, what?
Preserving democracy.
Yeah, there have been quite a few articles about different things that people are doing, affecting voting. Right, right, gender topics. Yes, we're doing, like on abortion rights, we are getting some coverage on that. Right, Democrats are talking about how bad the Republicans are. Yes, and transgender issues, tons of stuff about that. So, yes,
Drag
women's
queens, I
reproductive
see in the
rights,
chat.
gun violence, yeah, so these are all, right, gun regulations. So these are all issues that are in the public debate. So how do agendas get set? There's really like three ways that an agenda can get set. By circumstances, things happen, and then we respond to them. So when you have like a shooting, you have a law that gets passed or proposed, that's like situations that are happening that we're responding to. But also by us and by the Republicans, like we can do things, we have a role in setting the agenda, what we talk about, what conservatives talk about. And part of what's interesting is that a lot of the things that we're responding to, like the Clarence Thomas issue, that I think is, I don't know if that's journalism, like if that's news reporting. I don't know who like broke those stories. Some of the stories that are coming up are, journalists that are actually like digging things up and finding things out. Some of them are like foreign policy things that are happening, when something happens in the war in Ukraine, that gets into the news. And then it's like, kind of, how do we respond to that? But a lot of what's happening is conservatives are pushing stories into the public debate by doing horrible things that we then have to respond to. So they, like, if you think they really actually give a crap about, gender issues, about gay people, about transgender issues became an issue because they could no longer milk gay marriage as a political issue because nobody cares about it anymore. People were like, we're good with that, we're ready to move on. And so they were like, oh, well, now we have this other thing, so so one of the things they do to set the agenda is do a coordinated project of trying to pass laws that are ridiculous, or offensive, probably unconstitutional, so that they can then dominate the news cycle about that. So what I would say is, what do we think should be the agenda? So if you could choose, so say there was going to be a story that was going to be on the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post in some way or the other for like the next couple of weeks, what do you think that story ought to be? Like if you had control, if you had unilateral control over the public debate agenda, what would you want it to be?
I would say it would be about defending democracy, like Joel said. I mean, it's just scary out there right now. So that's what would be a good thing for me.
Okay, you
I
can
think,
go ahead and unmute yourself and just chime in if you like.
I think the agenda or the topics should be about how the economy has improved over the last couple of years, and how much better it is. It's not good enough, but we need to talk more about how much better it is.
Okay. How about the climate, Hobie? I'll tell you what's keeping me up at night is the climate situation. Like, I feel like if there was, other things we can fix, we don't fix the climate thing, we're in pretty deep shit. So when it comes to priorities, I feel like that's something that really needs to be on the front burner a lot more. Could you do me a favor? Some people are, if you're sharing your screen and I'm on your screen, it's really distracting to me to see my face in multiple places at once while I'm trying to talk. So if you could not share your screen, if I am on your screen, that would be helpful. But let's see, right, so there's things like the national, right, so Federico talks about the national debt default. That's another thing that is, that's a Republican messaging thing where it is a genuine threat, but they're making a threat so that they can, because what they're doing is they're actually willing to threaten the entire global economy in order to make a messaging point about associating Democrats with high spending. So like that is the lengths that they will go to get a topic into the public debate. So I'm looking at if everybody has the notes up, I'm looking at, or the chat. I'm looking at a lot of these different things. And one of the things I want to ask is for how many of you, when I said, well, what do you think should be the top issue? Had to stop and think about it, like didn't have an answer right off of like what you thought the top issue ought to be, So one of the things that we have to do, I would say this is step one towards figuring out how to set the agenda, is getting out of the mindset of responding to what the Republicans are doing and thinking about what you believe. If you could wave a magic wand, what do you think people out there need to be thinking about and should be thinking about? And so that's kind of like step one for us, is getting into a practice of keeping at the top of our mind, what do we think people ought to be talking about out there? Because they're so busy driving the agenda that we spend so much time responding that we never even get out there and put our own, put the issues that we think are important out there. So let me see. Operating intelligence leaks. Yeah, the there's default. Climate activist working. Let's see.
So the person who talked about the economy, the changes in the economy that have been good, that would be a really good thing, like you're saying, like the improvements, where we are and what we need to keep doing. Yep.
Especially
Now
if it's-
that's an interesting one, because I think that there's two aspects to that. One of which is that that people have jobs and people are returning to the workforce, but we also have we have to make sure that we're expressing that message in a way that doesn't make people feel like the struggles that they're having are not legit. Because as we know, the cost of housing, the cost of healthcare, the cost of college, what we have now is we've almost switched from a problem in which people don't have a job into which people have a job and they still can't afford to live. So we always risk that, we always have to balance that like sort of credit taking or things are good with making sure that we're hearing what people are experiencing. Michael, you can just jump in. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I just got done with the meeting with Climate Reality Project, Al Gore's group, on focusing on utilizing the new legislation that was created by our DFL, or Democratic Congress, to address climate change. And I know that it's not on the top of people's minds, but it does address almost every issue that people are going to touch on in terms of costs of living. Fossil fuels are the cause of much of the inflation that we are dealing with. The opportunities for the clean energy economy that we can build are enormous, and the DFL owns that completely in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act. The GOP didn't raise a single vote in favor of that landmark bill. If you sit down and think about, again, almost every issue that comes up, it always is touched by climate or the environment in one way or another. And I believe that there's just a huge opportunity for the Democratic Party to use that proactively, constructively, and make the point that we need bipartisan action on this, but we need to lead, because the other party is not. And so I'll stop there, but thank you for letting me share.
Thank you. Well, here, let's use that as an example. So it's a high priority issue, but it is not a priority where you have something happening today where you can say, oh my God, big news on climate today. Other than the crazy weather, which is something that we could tap into when possible. But if there's not something happening that we can use to sort of propel our issue onto the agenda, I've noticed that with a lot of the stuff like the crazy rain, they just, like Fort Lauderdale was just under a couple of feet of water. These things that are happening, so one thing we could do is anytime something happens, jump on that, put out content saying, this is the consequence. This is the price we're paying for not doing something about this. We have to take action. But also, one of the things I want to illustrate is that, so say we have these things that we want to get out there. It's good news that people have jobs. That is good. We passed a bill that put some funding towards things that are going to help us with the environment. If you put out a press release that said, because of this bill, we're going to be building a bridge in this town. Like if you're in a town and it's getting a bridge built, that might be news. But part of it is that, what do you think the press, like what gets into the news? What are they willing to cover, or what gets coverage, in social media? Is it, nice things happening? So the, one of the points that I think that I would like to make. So here's a question that I have for you. Which do you think is better for you in the public debate? To say something that is so irrefutable that nobody could possibly, like, you come out with a statement, drop the mic, end of story, nobody could refute what you're saying because it's so unbelievably, indisputably right. Or you say something that even you can't 100% defend or isn't somewhat in question, but you go out there and make a statement and the Republicans freak out and jump all over you. I'm sure you can tell this is something of a trick question. What do you think we do now? Like when Democrats go out in public, what kind of things do we say? Do we, which one of the things are we more likely to say? The first one, the absolutely flawless, I have scrubbed everything controversial, or like anything you could possibly criticize has been scrubbed from this statement, or I'm just going to go ahead and say it. Which one is, so who thinks Democrats mostly go with number one? Well, fun. So, okay, so Federico, you say we're more likely to do the second. What do you explain that? Because it seems in my impression that Democrats really are so afraid of being responded to or yelled at that we're very loath to say something that people are that they're gonna get pushback from.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. But I was just thinking, just the many Dems who just say, the main goal is, okay, I'm gonna set the record straight, and I'm just gonna tell them the facts. I'm just going to, and then at whatever cost. So I suppose saying something irrefutable would be using moral language, the one that the type that you advocate for, which I think is great.
Well, let me kind of make a better distinction about what I'm trying to say here. I think that, right, when you talk about things in terms of right and wrong, part of what you're doing is you are making, like a lot of what we do is we say, here are a bunch of numbers that basically prove that I am indisputably right. These are facts, these are things that you can back up. And then we put it out there and sort of, the Republicans just say, oh, you're wrong, or they ignore the facts, or the press doesn't pick it up, or we make a statement and it doesn't carry out there into the news. It might get, somebody might cover what we're saying. We might put a post out online, but it doesn't necessarily get hugely shared. We just list some facts. If you want something to get into the public debate, you have to make, one of the reasons why we need Democrats to make moral judgments, make statements that actually have a moral judgment, is because the public debate is about right and wrong. And also because that's where we disagree with the Republicans. It's they think what we're doing is morally wrong, and we think what they're doing is morally wrong. But usually what happens is they say that we're doing something morally wrong, and then we argue back about them, but we're on defense. And so what our job is to do something that puts them on defense, so that we're talking about what we think we ought to be talking about. So I'm going to try to find an example of a piece of something I can share that will give you an example. So, okay, here's I'm going to share my screen in a second here. Can you enable screen sharing, please, George?
Check it out, Antonia. I think I just did enable it.
Okay. Screen share, okay. So, so this is I'm using mostly Instagram posts because it just makes it easier to compare different sources and whatnot. So this headline, it says the GOP just passed a blueprint for bullying teachers. Now I'm researching a bill that they have that is about what they call curriculum transparency, which is about allowing parents to monitor what teachers are teaching and, lob in with complaints in ways that allow a single teacher to, it's like the thing with the book banning that's been going on, where it's one parent can object to something and they'll take it. MC just in this headline, what they did is, I think what I'm trying to say is the public debate is always about an argument, because if people either agree with you or are not willing to fight you, you're not going to get any coverage. You have to take on some kind of a fight, and the question is, what is that fight going to be? So if this headline said the GOP just passed a proposal for curriculum transparency, the question would be, should parents have the right to know what teachers are teaching? Now, if that's the question, then the reasonable person would say, well, I mean, I guess parents should have the right to know what they're being taught. But if you phrase it this way and you say it's about bullying teachers, then the question is, you know, should parents have the ability, should parents be allowed to bully teachers? And the answer to that question is, you know, for the average person would say, well, no, parents shouldn't be allowed to bully teachers. So do you see what I'm saying about, here, let me stop share, about, it depends on which question you're getting people to talk about. So like so even if it's the same topic, if you use the language that you have to look at the content and say, what question is this bringing up? What is it that is being debated? Because in any given topic, there is a question about it. There is a discussion, a debate that you could presume that any reasonable person would answer in our favor. And there is also question, like if you say, you know, if you were to say, you know, should an unborn child be killed? Somebody might say, you know, the average person who's not thinking about it too deeply or is just hearing about it in the background is going to be like, well, no, you don't want to kill people. But if you say, do people have the right to control what happens to their own bodies? The average person is going to say, well, of course they do. That's what it means to be free. So the question is, it's not what are we saying, what are we going out there and saying that is going to convince the Republicans that they're wrong? It is, what debate can we put out there where a reasonable person would be, just because of the way the question is phrased, come down on our side of it, or we can use that question to get them to see it the way that we see it. So it sounds weird to think like we want people to argue against us, but the truth of the matter is that the way we phrase things is what gets people to see it from our perspective. Do you see abortion access as a question of people's right to control their own bodies, or do you see it in terms of, and so if we keep the subject matter on, you know, whether or not we have the right to control our bodies, then that's the perspective people are seeing it from. And our mission is not to win that debate, drop the mic and walk out of the room, because then we're not getting any more coverage. Our mission is to be just a little bit controversial about it and force conservatives to fight back on our terms, because we don't want to be having an argument over, well, when does life begin? At what point does a fetus feel pain? All of those questions are keeping people in the conservative mindset. If somebody were to come out and say, and there's actually a couple people arguing this, that abortion bans should be illegal under the, is it the 13th or the 14th Amendment? The 13th, I think, because it's involuntary servitude. And then somebody might say, well, are you saying that it's slavery to force a woman to carry a child that she doesn't carry? And we could say, well, what do you think? You know, like we might say, well, I don't want to come out and call it's not equivalent to slavery, but it's still, what do you call it when you force somebody to do something with their body against their will? And then you let the Republicans try to answer that question.
So Antonia, what I
Yeah.
see here is, this is something we've talked about in the past as what we call, are we talking about the right issue? As part of when we do our stop, drop, and roll, we're analyzing what's being said and what we're doing. And so what you're saying here that I see is the right issue here is not to pick up whatever the Republicans are and argue with them about it, We need to switch out of their frame. We need to switch into ours. So that's step one. And step two, which I think helps to, so switching it to ours is we're setting the agenda, but it's going to go nowhere unless we make it something that people are going to talk about and the news is going to cover, and nothing does that better than making a bit of a controversy. Maybe that's an intellectual controversy. Maybe it's a, they're passing a bullying bill. So we're just, we're kind of pushing the envelope a little bit on that, but that kind of stuff gets attention. And so agenda setting seems to, if I'm summing up what you're saying, it consists of those two things, to switch to what we want to talk about, and then talk about it not only from within our values, always, as Hobie was mentioning in the chat, but do it in a way that gets attention. And
Exactly.
usually that means making a somewhat controversial statement or something that people are going to argue about a little bit.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, we usually talk about framing things in terms of our values, but but there's kind of two parts of this. One is you have a certain amount of territory that you control where you set the agenda. When you go on your Facebook page, when you put some content out, you're in control of that agenda. You own that space. You have to, first of all, stop and think, how am I using that space? How am I using the real estate under my control? Am I using it to respond to what they're talking about, or I'm using it to talk about what I think matters? Step one is to take any amount of real estate that you have under your control and stop using it to talk about Trump, to talk about any other stuff, and use it to talk about what you think is important. If we all did that, we would change the agenda of the public debate overnight, because 3/4 of what we put out is responding to what they're talking about. And I think that, but then, George makes a good distinction there, which is one is then, so you have a topic, and the topic might be access to abortion, or the topic might be a bill that conservatives are putting out there that is doing all these horrible things to teachers. But then the frame is, our frame is it's teacher harassment. Their frame is it's parents' rights. So if they say it's a parents' rights bill and we say, oh, that's ridiculous, you shouldn't call it a parents' rights bill, part of what's happening is that they're trying to expose persuadable people to the words that activate the frames in their mind that they want made. So they want people thinking about parents and what are the rights of parents. And so the more they say parents and rights together, they activate the parents frame, they activate the rights frame, they glue those two things together by repeating them in the press. The more they say parents' rights, parents' rights, parents' rights, parents' rights, the more people think about things from the perspective of the rights of parents. It's literally exposure to trigger words. So
Isn't that what some of the
comes
bills
out
are
there with
actually,
his words, yeah.
some of the bills are actually named Parents' Bill of Rights.
Oh, every bill that Republicans puts out is basically a trigger cocktail.
Mhm.
It is, they figure out what things they want to activate in people's minds. They figure out what words are going to activate those. They stick those words together and try to come up with a passingly plausible sentence to stick both of those words in. And Trump doesn't even bother to do that. He just his word salad. And you think, how could word salad actually be effective? All he does is he has Hillary Clinton, and he wants to attach something negative to Hillary Clinton. So he says crooked and he says Hillary, and he says it together over and over again so that people think crooked and Hillary in the same sentence. And that's it. You don't even need a sentence. It's not even a question of making a good logical argument or much. It's like so much of what happens in the public debate is simply about triggering the words involved. And so the question is, in this situation, what I like about that post about bullying teachers is that MSNBC did what most Democrats rarely ever do, which is think, how do we see what they're doing? Like, we see this as a form of teacher harassment, of teacher bullying. And so we're going to use those words. And so when people think about this issue, we want them to think about bullying teachers, about the effect that this has on teachers, about how they're being treated. You know, the using the term bullying makes a negative moral term to the people who are doing this. That is a framing of it. That's the framing we want out there. And so if we just repeat those terms, bullying teachers, or harassing teachers, or whatever it is, then we're activating the parts of people's brains that would get them to look at it from our perspective. Carol, did you?
Yeah, so, you know, the piece that I get at is we need to shift it off of the parents' rights and we need to move it over to the children. And we need to say that Democrats value the importance of educating all children, regardless of where they live, regardless of how much their parents make, regardless of what religion they may know, and that public education is critical to an educated economy and ultimately to an American democracy. And that is, I hope that's where people can get their values going as it relates to public education. But when you start going down the acknowledge the parents' rights and you go, well, yeah, parents need to have rights, you fall into the trap.
Yes.
Because parents have always had rights, irregardless. And that's where the dilemma sits, is move the debate over to children and the importance of educating all children. And that's what we do in America. So
Yes. So there's two things that we're doing there. One is, if you are in a situation where the subject of the situation is particularly the bills that they're passing there, and you are making comment on that. So what we need to do is we have two jobs. One is you frame that thing that's happening from the Democratic perspective, and then you use that to tie it back to our bigger values. So what we say is, you know, so somebody might say, what do you think about this parents' Bill of Rights that they just passed in Florida or whatever? And what you say is something like, you know, what they're doing is they're giving parents a permission slip to harass teachers, and they're creating like a vigilante, you know, they're unleashing vigilante parenting on these teachers, because they don't want us to have a successful public education system. We believe that we need public education because every single child deserves a good education. You know, we believe that's when you go into the we believe about stuff, but you get that into the press by flipping their frame, not by saying, oh, their frame is wrong, that and do it in a way that like you were saying, don't go down the rabbit hole of parents' rights and say, well, parents have rights, but there's a limit. Then you're losing that argument, because you're trying to argue in their frame. You're trying to argue on their terms. So what you do is you take that situation, you put it into our terms, and then you use that as your sort of jumping pad to talk about our values and to talk about. And then you can go into it and say, look, you know, we believe that public education is for everybody. There are people who would rather take their children, you know, one of the perspectives I like on that is that public education is what makes people Americans. It is where all of the people come together from all these different places and walks in life and learn these common values, like respecting each other and allowing people to be, you know, who they are, and treating them with respect, and learning from each other's cultures and all of these positive things. And there are people out there who do not want us to have that. And that is why they are fighting. That is why they are trying to drive teachers out of the profession, you know, because they want to privatize the schools and make a profit and segregate, you know, like, so talk about the controversial thing. I think we should start talking about resegregating the schools. Because a lot of what this privatization shit is about is, there was a great post I saw just recently that said, basically like, so it's like, if you had parents who said, I don't want my kid playing in this park because I don't want them to be around these bad kids, I'm going to take my kids over here and I want to build them a fancy new playground that the other kids aren't allowed to play in, but I want to take your public dollars to do it. We'd all be like, are you nuts? That's crazy. But that's exactly what they're doing with the voucher systems, and you know, and there's really this effort to destroy public schools and to take bunches of children and segregate them off into this private space with taxpayer dollars. So I think if you went out and said, you know, these are advocates of school resegregation, you'd get some press response.
Mhm.
But then you'd have to just take that statement and say, and I mean, and I'm just throwing this out there off the top of my head, so I think we could word it better. But the idea is like, how do you get people to cover what you're talking about? And it's like MSNBC kind of gets the idea of this. I haven't seen a lot of Democrats go out there and say, you know, this is about vigilante parenting. You know, this is about people who are trying to destroy trust in public schools. This is about people, this is about corporations that have an interest in getting their hands on public school funding. This is about people who want to resegregate the public schools so that because they want to take public money and use it to create schools that you know, where elites don't have to mix with the regular people. You know, those are all ways of saying it that then you see, then the reporter goes back to the conservative and says, they claim that you just want to destroy faith in public schools. What do you have to say about that? Then they're being forced to respond to our frame. And so
And
then
Antonia,
so you mix these elements together, and that's how you get these stories out there.
let me throw something in here too,
Yeah.
just to go just a little meta on this. What's interesting about the bullying frame is when searching for the right issue or the actual issue, the real issue behind things, a lot of the reason that these local groups are being supported to go after school boards is, yes, about private schools, privatizing education and killing off public schools. But it's also about the Republicans looking to build a ground game. The idea of having people out there bullying school boards and in general acting out on the local level is their realization that the only thing keeping the Democrats alive is a really good ground game. And they don't really have a good ground game. They have propaganda, which they're really good at. If they also get a ground game, all of a sudden that gives them a real advantage. So it's the school board today, but it's the city council tomorrow. It's the legislator. And you can bet that there are people in there looking to see who are the emerging leaders here at the school board level. So what's interesting is that term bullying, and which is, you know, bullying to get their way, is will easily transfer to whatever the next subject is. So then the controversy becomes, why are the Republicans bullying people? Why aren't they being, you know, why aren't they working with others? And framing them as that kind of person in this context also lets us do it in the next. So keep an eye out for those issues that are kind of hiding in the background that are maybe at the core of what's going on. You know, keeping in mind that when the Republicans do this stuff, again, the strategists, the propagandists don't really care all that much about that issue or any of these other ones. The issues they bring up are meant to be distractions for everybody so that they can accomplish the prime directive, which is to concentrate wealth in fewer and fewer hands and
Right.
get all the power. That's what the reality is. All the rest of the stuff is made to get everybody talking about anything but that. And that's why this is so important. The agenda setting is getting it off of that in a way that doesn't acknowledge what their frames are, to not even touching bases with them, to come up with what we think ought to be talked about. So it's also a question of should we be spending most of our time talking about the particular subjects that the Republicans have chosen to get controversial about? We may have to think about our choice of subjects. And there are
Right.
many things like climate, like healthcare, that take a backseat to other issues quite often because people understandably get impassioned about other issues. So
Yeah.
anyway, I just wanted to throw that in
Yeah,
there.
yeah, you're
Yeah,
right.
think
I
about
like
that
the
larger context.
larger themes. Bullying, I think, is a really important theme because it comes up in so many places. And I think there is a big there's a big discussion to be had about describing the way corporate actors are acting as they're bullying their employees. Like when you are taking the power that you have because you are an employer over people's lives, And instead of treating your employees like a person and an equal and a partner in your business, you just bully them. You make them do whatever you want them to do because you can, because you're big. I think that that's a lot of what people are feeling. A lot of what people are pushing back in against is this idea that, like, I'm dealing with this healthcare company, I'm dealing with my boss, I'm dealing with these, and people just screw me, and they do it because they can, and I can't do anything about it. People feel bullied. And so I think that that's a great, that's a sort of a metaphor that I think we can extend to a lot of what's going on. It's like, I'm doing it because I can. And one of the things that we as Democrats need to push back on is this idea, like, just because you can bully people doesn't mean that it's okay that you do it. It might not even be illegal to do it. It's still shitty. You know, like, we need to treat people with respect. A lot of what we're trying to put out there is that there's, you know, we need to treat each other with consideration. We need to treat each other with respect, and not just because it's profitable, or we, you know, like, it's not always about the bottom line. It's about being decent to each other, because we live in a society together, and we ought to be decent to each other. And we ought to treat people with respect, and people deserve that. And that's the kind of thing that bullying is a great term for that, because you know, everybody hates the bully. Everybody hates the bully, and everybody feels like they're being bullied. I would say one thing though about the local organizing, Republicans have always been better at ground organizing, because they have always put money on the ground into the school, and they're doing it, yes, in order to build political power, but they're not wrong in doing that. What's wrong about it, like, we should be doing that. We should be out there meeting with parents, you know, organizing people on the ground. We should be out there working on the school board races and the city council races. That's on us. They're not wrong for doing that. And, you know, they've always gone in and done that with the Tea Party guys and everything. They have, you know, since the days of the Bush family has a Christmas card list of everybody who's influential in every small town in America. It's because they keep track of who's important on the ground and who's active in their communities. And that's just good organizing on their part. Where it goes awry is when you have corporate forces that are hovering around, and they see a parent speaking up at a school board meeting, and they swoop in and put a bunch of funding behind that parent. That's, you know, that's what I call, you know, turning parents into puppets. Like, what you want to suggest is not that they're going around and organizing people, because they're not really organizing. They're creating puppets for this, for an outside agenda. So you can terms like outside agitators, or, you know, corporate dupes, you know, as people who are being taken advantage of by people with an agenda. I'm just getting that message that my signal is unstable. Am I still good?
Yeah, you cut out for a second, but you're back.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you're right. So there's, you know, we have to separate those issues of, like, if we are talking about this issue, we want to talk about it in a way that allows us to, one, provoke, you know, like think in your mind, I'm talking to a reporter and I want to give them the question that they're going to run over to the Republicans and ask them. And so how do I put this in a term that is going to make them go and then say, you know, are you giving parents a license to harass teachers? Like, whatever that question is, you want to kind of feed them that question, but then you want to use it to talk about our values, why we are for public education. You want to bring in themes that talk about things like bullying, which is, you know, a kind of emotional shortcut to the idea of people are using their power to take advantage of people. We can use that to connect to a bunch of other issues. But then you also have the question of, so sometimes you are actually in a conversation where you're talking about a specific issue, and that's kind of what's on the table. But everywhere that we can, we need to be talking about what the things that we believe are the most important issues. So I'm going to pull up, hang on, where did my mouse go? Oh, there it is. And I'm sorry, I've kind of lost track of the chat. So George and Lisa, if you could help me pull content out of there, pull notes of things that you think we should be, that people are saying that we might want to address. All right, so I'm gonna pull up the Instagram, what's on the top of the sort of DNC Instagram right now. Let's see, share screen.
While you're doing that, there are some really good things in the chat.
Yeah.
People are really coming up with
Yeah.
really good things to talk about.
All right,
And
so you guys, I'm gonna take a quick look at the chat while you talk about this, while you read some of these posts here, okay? Let's see. Mhm. Okay, so as you can see here, this is like the last 12 posts put out by the DNC Instagram page. Are they trying to set an agenda? What are they talking about here?
They're talking about abortion as healthcare.
Yeah, absolutely. So they're not they're doing a good job of using the real estate that they have to push the issue that they believe is what we should be talking about right now. I'm not sure that abortion as healthcare is the most effective framing that we have, but in terms of just saying, we think this is what we ought to be talking about, like they've obviously done some studies. Okay, hang on, I'm gonna close back out of there and, okay. So they've obviously seen some polling and stuff like that, where they know that abortion is a winning issue for us. And with the judicial election that we just had, that was so much more successful than anybody was expecting. You know, they're like, you can tell they're seeing numbers that say abortion is an issue that people are still passionate about. They care about this. This is going to continue to be a winning issue for us. And so they're not using their media real estate to talk about Trump and what Trump is doing. They're actually doing a very good job of sticking to the message or sticking to the topic that they believe is most important. And so, you know, if we were to continue to, if only the other sources, you know, media sources that Democrats had were to stay on, if we were all hammering away on that, we would be, that would actually go a long way toward keeping that issue front and center. And then the question would be, you know, how do we provoke more debate about it? How do we talk about this? How do we push, like I still think that, and I've been pretty clear on this, that at least from my perspective, if you look at it from a question of what does it mean to be a free person, and if being a free, and there's a woman in Arizona who's brilliant at framing, and she just, the way that she put it was, her name is Deidre Abood. She's just brilliant, and the way she put it was, I think, we don't use other people's bodies against their will, not even to save the life of another person. Which is true. Like, if you think of it that way, like, we wouldn't go to somebody and say, hey, we're going to take one of your kidneys to save this person's life. That person could be a living adult. And we would not dream of going to another living person saying, you know, I know you don't want to, but we need one of your kidneys to go save this person's life. We would never do that. We don't even take people's organs when they're dead without their consent. So the idea that we can force women to go through this months of about some of the most radical transformation you can possibly go through with your body, and pain and medical risk, it's just nuts. But if you look at it, right, so forced pregnancy, I think is a good term. Thank you again, Federico. Yeah, medical servitude, because the term in the 13th Amendment is like involuntary servitude. So if we talk about involuntary medical servitude, that's like a good, so, I don't know why we're not talking about it that way. I feel like if we pushed out there into the world this idea of like, just what exactly does it mean to be a free person? And are you saying that women do not, basically are not free? Like, we do not have the right to be in control of our own bodies? Then that's the debate we're having. Then that's the argument that we're having. Should women have the right to physical self-determination? And then we can say things like, well, you have all these people running around here saying that masks are an imposition on their freedom. How do you square that? Or that, like, if we didn't even force people to get vaccinations, even in the middle of like essentially a global plague, we did not, at no point did we force anybody to get a vaccination. It was always optional. There were other things that you could do, but it was always optional because we believe in bodily integrity, because we believe that. I think if we were pushing that, instead of these sort of like, abortion is health. Well, yeah, it's healthcare, but that doesn't push people's buttons. And it doesn't really, like if you say, like, what do we know about healthcare? So one of the things I'm trying to help people understand is that it's about using words that are loaded with meaning. So when we say abortion is healthcare, what are we trying to communicate? We're trying to communicate that everybody has a right to get the care they need for their body. In our society, how tolerant are we of people not having the health care that they need? Does the idea that something is healthcare, like if we were in England and we said this is healthcare, people would be like, well, hell yeah, in this country, healthcare is a right. The government gives it to you without charge. Like that's it. But here, millions of people don't have healthcare. We have incredibly high hurdles to people to getting healthcare. Is it an automatic? I'm not saying it's not a rational thing to say. You can say abortion care is healthcare and healthcare is a human right, but we're not going through and activating that whole chain of thought. We're leaving it up to people to sort of figure that out. Whereas if you say forced pregnancy is a form of slavery, those buttons are pushed. That doesn't leave anything to people to have to put all the dots together themselves. So the question is, what do we want people to think, and what are the buttons that we need to push to get them to think that, and how can we do it in a way that is going to force people to pay attention and is going to allow people to then raise questions. Like, we might not come out and be like, it's slavery. Obviously slavery was a different thing and much more comprehensive thing. But by raising the question, see, that's what Tucker Carlson does. And people say, how does Tucker Carlson have so much control over what people talk about? Because he says things that even he wouldn't actually come out and say, but he raises them in the form of a question. Like, well, I don't know, is this what, and it's provocative. And we can come out and say, well, does this qualify as slavery? And then we can argue about it for 3 weeks. And then we could say, no, it doesn't really quite qualify as slavery, but I think it qualifies as involuntary medical servitude. We can lose our own argument that we start and still use it to dominate the public debate for weeks. We could have parts of the Democratic coalition pick arguments with other parts of the Democratic coalition and fight over them. Just to get our agenda out there in the press.
Democrats fight.
Yeah, we're always arguing with each other. Why not? Like, we could use it. Like we could like secretly agree with like some faction of the Democratic coalition, for them to say that, and then we could argue and say, but what it would do, it would take the question. Like, there literally are arguments that we can provoke that we can lose, and we still benefit just by making that something that everybody is arguing about. So it's like, one, figure out what it is that you think is an important thing to talk about. 2, what is it that you want people thinking about that thing? 3, what are the words we can use that are loaded, preloaded with meaning? that you don't have to explain to people, that you don't have to tell a long story, but just by using those words like bully or slavery or involuntary or whatever, those words that come already loaded with that meaning that you can attach to that situation. How do we say something controversial or provoke get people to ask a question that will allow us to use those words together? Because every time we use a word like bullying or slavery, we're like pushing buttons in people's heads, pushing that bullying button. And the more we can keep that word out there, our job is to say the word as frequently as we can. So when you see Republicans on the talk shows, one of the things you will notice is that they have a phrase that they will just repeat over and over and over and over again. And it's because they understand that their job is to push, not to convince the person interviewing them, not to beat the Democrats. It's to push the button of the guy watching at home push the button in their brain that gets them to see it the way they want it to be seen. And so that's a process that we have to go through to figure out, like I said, what do we think people should be talking about? How do we want them to see it? What are words we can use to activate that part of their brain? And then what do we do to provoke people into using those words that we want them to use over and over and over and over and over again until it gets out there? And that's how we are setting the agenda. And it sounds crazy, but that's actually how it works. So
I'm just going to say, we're past our time right now.
Yeah.
And so I know some people will probably start leaving. So I would like to, people can stay on though. And Antonia, I mean, if you got more, then we'll stay on. But I just want to make sure we wrap this up. I will be sending out a recap. And I just want to say that in especially the last several of Antonia's Substacks, she has a section in there that says, say this, not this. And I think that goes to what you were just saying right now on specific subject areas. So you're not you're using the trigger words that are going to get the most response rather than using other things that won't get as good of a response. So I just wanted to point that out, because then I will send the link to Antonia's Substack too.
Okay, there's some questions in there. So Brian said, should they be mixing positive and negative messaging together, like abortion is healthcare positive plus DeSantis is prohibiting abortions for rape victims negative? So I talked about sort of the positive argument. Saying abortion is healthcare is a positive point. I do not think by any stretch it is our strongest point. I think it requires a certain amount of knowledge on the part of the listener. It requires them to make some assumptions about healthcare that the average non-paying attention swing voter is not necessarily going to make. I think we have stronger arguments that we can make, but I also have we don't want to give DeSantis more coverage. Every time we mention his name, the neurons in people's brains that are the Ron DeSantis part of people's brains get stronger. Every time we switch it on, it makes it stronger. We should do everything we can to not talk about him at all. Also, I personally, and I have to admit that on the spectrum of positions on abortion access, I am pretty far to one end of the argument. And one of the things that I think is not our strongest approach is what I call the justifiable abortion frame, which is to say, like, well, if you don't think everybody should have the right to have an abortion, at least you think, people who did not voluntarily get pregnant should be allowed to. And so what you're saying in a sense is, one, you're weakening the argument, I think, is it doesn't matter how they got pregnant, it doesn't matter why, like they still, to me, there is no case in which a woman still doesn't have the right to make the decisions about her own body. So when we make those arguments about the innocent pregnant woman or the innocent abortion, we're kind of like taking 98% of the women having abortions and saying, like, well, forget them. let's just talk about these, like we're already capitulating a huge portion of the argument. And I think that that hurts us in terms of the bigger picture, which is that it's not about judging whether the women have the right, whether they somehow did something to get themselves pregnant. That's irrelevant to the issue, I think. That's me. That's where I stand on it. And I think that when we make those cases, we are in a certain sense capitulating a large part of the issue, right? So why are we not holding men accountable for unplanned? Yes, that's a good. And I think we also, that's a big question as well.
Lenny, do you have a question?
Tony, if I can get back to the
Yeah.
question that I posted there.
Yes.
I guess I wasn't meaning to post a question about abortion. What about the structure of that example that
A
you
negative, right?
showed?
okay.
Because I looked at it, it had all these tiles of different things, and some of the messages were positive about freedom and so on. Some of them were negative, and it was all
I'm gonna
thrown together into
take a
one
look at
message.
that one again, just for myself.
And I think generally I try to
Right.
avoid that and make it's either a strong positive or a strong negative.
So
but not
this
both.
is, so the wrong, like I think one, we should not, like the stuff where they're going after Ron DeSantis, that does not help. All we're doing is raising his profile. What we're doing every time we talk about him, we are essentially boosting him up the ladder of because I think Trump is going to have so many legal issues. I don't know that he's even going to make it to the election. So what we're doing is we're telling everybody, Ron DeSantis is your hero if you are in this camp.
Mhm.
And so, no, we should not talk about him at all. That doesn't mean that we can, and I think when we talk about being positive, I think that the most effective attack is actually to be positive in a way that implies that the people who are not, that do not have your position are clearly morally wrong, but you're talking about it in the positive. Like you're saying, I believe that every person has a body that they have the right to do with, it's their body. They have the right to do with it what they want to do. And nobody else can make them do something with that body against their will. And, whether that's true, whether you're a man or a woman or whatever it is, we can't have, we're Americans, we believe in freedom. We cannot have freedom in this country if we are using people's bodies against their will. And then that's a positive message that we believe in that freedom, that we believe in that right to bodily autonomy. And bodily autonomy is a term a lot of people don't know and understand. So we want to use terms that people do understand, using somebody's body against their will, I think is pretty clear. Nobody's going to miss that meaning. Or physical liberty also works, bodily liberty, bodily freedom. Those are terms that nobody needs to be explained what those terms mean. But I think that, if somebody says, oh, what do you have to say about Ron DeSantis passing this, 6-week abortion ban? Rather than saying, oh, Ron DeSantis is a horrible person, he hates women. If you just say, I believe that in this country, we don't use other people's bodies against their will, that's more powerful. And it's not going to make him more popular. It's not going to trigger a defensive position from somebody out there who has, who's on the fence about the issue. It's just stating what you believe in a positive way, but it's also really, I think, more effective at condemning what the other people are doing than just saying they're bad, they're wrong, whatever.
Showing a
So
contrast
you're always
between
better off in the positive contrasts. Let the contrast be implied in what you're saying.
Yes.
Be positive. Don't give them the coverage. Yeah. So, there. I know we're kind of running late time, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, Greg Layden's got one.
Yeah.
What about a message? In fact, Greg, do you just want to ask it?
Sure. As we're talking about abortion in particular, I'm wondering how much is a message advanced or helped by bringing in the fact that it is a widely held belief or a widely held position as well. That words, there are trigger words that can be used to link a message to to widespread acceptance or normalcy, potentially.
Well, that, I mean, that is the term, the silent majority was always intended to, that was actually a very deliberate strategy by the conservatives, because they knew that that sort of Barry Goldwater free market version of morality that they were pushing was very unpopular. It was thought to be, you know, really kind of heartless and cruel even. And so and they knew that in the public debate, people did not agree with what they were talking about. So they were like, oh, well, there's the silent majority, like we're actually the majority, but you know, our people just aren't talking, you know. So there's always been this, there's always been a power to saying this is what most people think. Now, the Republicans these days have been, I mean, they've actually gotten to the point where they're like, what did one of them say? Like, if it's a fight between freedom and democracy, freedom is more important, as though freedom weren't completely dependent on democracy. There is a faction that is saying that, like, even if we're the minority, we're so morally right that we should be able to impose our minority moral views on the majority. But for the most part, yeah, like when we go out there and talk about, most gun owners want these laws, gun safety laws, most people, you know, in a democracy, I think those are strong. I think that is a strong, it is not in and of itself. It's, I mean, politically, I think it has some value, just in that people do like to be on the winning side, but I think we also have a situation where people are very frustrated by this idea that the majority of the people in this country want something, and yet we can't get our politicians to do it. And that's part of why a lot of this talk about, like, everybody wants gun reform, everybody want, like, but why don't we get it? That's a lot of the frustration people are having with government, and saying government's not working because, like, everybody wants us and yet somehow we can't make it happen.
Antonia, Rick Blake has a question.
Yeah, let's see.
Rick, you wanna?
Yeah, I can say it. Well, when I was running for office and I approach, you know, women's right to choose and abortion is healthcare, I had a couple people call me a baby killer. Okay, so how can you respond to something like that? What I would like to say is, actually, in places where people have choices and abortion is legal, less lives are lost. So in effect, I mean, I could almost say, you know, I'd like to respond and say, well, that's not really true. More lives are lost where abortion is not legal. So, but I don't know how to say that. I don't even know if that's if that approach is worthwhile, but there's a significant number of people in the district that I ran in that approach things that way. So I don't know how to respond to that.
I'm going to say, imagine in that situation that the people observing, your audience is the people who are watching you have that conversation. And so if you actually engage in the question of, like, who, you know, like, that person, you are not going to convince that person, obviously. And you should not even try. Like, they're clearly, they have a perspective that they see it from, and there's just not, I don't think there's anything that you're going to do to reach that person. So I guess I don't have the exact answer to that right now, but what I would say is, what is the thing that you could say, not that would win over that person, not to accept their terms of that debate and try to win them over on their terms, but think about the person standing 6 feet away, observing you have that conversation, and figure out what you could say that would make the best case to that person, because that's your audience. That's your persuadable audience.
I think I did fine then, so.
Yeah.
Good.
Good, good.
But I think, yeah, like you don't want to engage on, you don't want to concede the point that abortion is killing anyone. Like you don't like in answering it in a way that says, you know, fewer lives are lost. What you're saying is lives are being lost, you know? And so, I don't think you want to engage that, you know, you're probably better off just ignoring them, like not even engaging with that person. If that's what I would say.
Okay, well, I think that
Yeah.
worked. I mean, I think that's kind of what I did, but part of me wanted to respond. So.
Yeah, but you don't want to, I mean,
we all do.
We Democrats have a tendency to want to meet people where they are, but what we're doing really is we're saying if we concede 90% of your argument, we still think we're right, even based on your criteria. What we're doing is we're allowing their criteria to become the criteria by which the subject is being judged. And we need to stop doing that.
We probably have time for,
you know,
oh, I was gonna say, we probably have time for one more question. Let me just point something out. I know just on a personal level, being able to break out of my natural tendencies, which had always been towards coming up with that perfect rhetorical argument that will convince somebody of being right. And so I've worked really hard to get out of that. But also I noticed that what I pay attention to is highly dependent on what goes into my brain, which is kind of also what we've been talking about. I have been turning off the TV. I've been avoiding the news. I mean, really, it occurred to me, you know, watching MSNBC or, you know, which can be fun and, you know, there's good information there, but I realized that it's all the stories are the same. The Republicans said something really stupid, as we know, to gain attention. The media covers the something stupid and then analyzes something stupid for the next 2.5 hours, if not the entire day, with the hosts passing the you know, the issue and the analysis onto the next host. It's like some people call this admiring the problem, and we do so much of that. And I was personally doing it, and it got me, you know, all nerved out. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and start thinking about Trump, and it was like, wait a minute. I'm not going to let these people into my head to do this. And staying away from what they're saying. I mean, we've always said it's important to know what they're saying. If you're sitting down to talk specifically about an issue, you do have to know what they're saying, but you don't have to know it every day. You don't need to steep your brain so much in GOP things because what happens is then your brain is following their agenda. That's what's going on. That's what they want. And as our brains are following on our agenda, you know, I do what Rick wanted to do, and I'll go, well, yeah, but we have to prove them wrong. But no, you don't have to prove them wrong. You need to prove us right. And that by going out and talking about what we should talk about, staying away, you know, their agenda is very subtle. They are very, you know, it seems like it's out there and slapping you in the face, but what's really going on, like school boards, where the real issue is they're trying to build a ground game. We miss all of that because we're so busy thinking about this. Steep yourself in Antonia's Substacks, read Hobie's website, which is awesome. You know, if you want environmental messaging, it's great there. Look at all of the work that people are doing out there about the issues we care about and the things that we ought to be talking about, and steep ourselves in that and get away from the other stuff. I found it helped me not be so, you know, nerved out about stuff. You know, I got a little, and when you're physically and mentally more prepared to do this, because you're not getting all stressed out because of Trump and his basically his pro wrestling entourage, you know, you're going to be better at what you're doing. Or at least,
yeah,
I think I got better at it.
I agree. And I mean, one of the things I'm in the process of kind of reconfiguring this training, this kind of full day training that we're putting together. And, one of the things that I kind of put together was this idea that like, we can't control what gets triggered in our minds. When you hear a word, it gets triggered. All we have control over is what we choose to expose ourselves to. It's the exposure that we can control. We can choose what we choose to allow ourselves to be exposed to. And we can choose what we expose other people to. And that means not exposing them to Ron DeSantis, not exposing them to anything having to do with babies and fetuses and all of that. But that's really, when you use a word, things get triggered. And we can choose which triggers and which combinations of triggers we want to expose people to, but that's about it. And so we have to think in terms of what are we exposing people to and what are we choosing to expose ourselves to. Carol, did you?
Yeah, I'll just be really quick. I mean, one of the things that I've helped, if I could do it better all the time, it'd be great. But it's the whole difference between when you get a comment like that, you go into defense mode and you step backwards. Yeah. I think we have to find a way to step forward and go on offense. And it's almost like turn the question around and say, are you serious? I care more about kids. I care more about life. I care, and go on offense instead of bite on you have to defend a position that they put you in. So offense and defense, it's kind of like those can sit in your head and work fairly well.
Yeah, and I think if you kind of go through the list of the issues that you think are important, you figure out what it is you want people to think. So, if somebody came to me and said, oh, baby killer, or whatever, I would just say, like, look, I don't believe we ought to use other people's bodies against their will. I don't believe we should force women to use their bodies. That's it. End of story. You're not engaging their argument. You're stating yours. Just do that and walk away. That's going to be the most effective thing to do. Anne? Did you go ahead?
Oh, a quick comment, George. Agreed. I think you're absolutely right. That I'm on I watch MSNBC morning, noon, and night. I don't know that we can afford to ignore. I agree that we should be looking at online sources of information and alternatives, but I don't know that we can afford to ignore the way they're handling. They're just like falling right into the trap every single day, all day, every day, of covering the crap that the Republicans bring up. How do we create the news milieu, let's say? We are not holding them accountable, or I should say MSNBC is not holding them accountable for the political right for anything they ran on. We're falling into the trap of covering the nonsense that they've managed to turn this, current session into weaponization of government, you name it, issue that the debt ceiling and so on. How is it that we truly, and of course you can't even get a person on MSNBC on the phone, so I can't, nobody's listening to me about what you should cover, but somehow we on the political left have to demand that they stop falling into they ran on crime, inflation, borders, blah, blah. And let's see, lowering the price of gas. They're not being held accountable for any of that stuff. They have no solutions. Shouldn't the news be able to cover that and say, wait a minute, I thought you said.
Yep. And then they should also be covering what we want them to cover. How much coverage have you seen on any news about the details of some of the most impactful legislation that has been passed? All the stuff that in the Inflation Reduction Act and the various other things, Biden has been in many ways a transformative president.
Yes.
You don't hear about this. When you do, it's like, oh, well, they did this, this, and this. Okay,
well, once in a while,
now we're back to the Trump show.
They'll do a list, yes, but then it's the shiny object. It's Trump is being indicted today. Yes. Exactly.
I think that goes back to that question of there needs to be a controversy in order for something to be newsworthy. And we don't provoke controversy. We make statements. It's like Joe Biden has produced X number of jobs. They could say Joe Biden has produced X number of jobs. That's 10 seconds of news coverage.
Exactly.
We could say, we passed this great bill that's going to help, convert the country to renewable energy. Maybe we need to go out there and talk about the fact that, like, the big thing holding us up is that we need an entire new electrical grid. And so maybe we need to start some arguments about, like, we should do like the Eisenhower interstate highway system, and we need to build some electrical grids, and that means we're going to have to eminent domains to people's houses. Oh my God, that would get people up in arms.
That's great.
Like, let's put out a statement saying, we need to build a whole new electrical grid, and we might have to seize some people's property. That
will get covered. And they're
Oh my
talking about
God.
what we want them to talk about.
Yeah, that's great.
And
Oh my God, that would delight people. People just save the freaking planet. This is going to have to get done. Should the integrity of your backyard be able to stop us from saving the planet we all depend on to survive? Then we're having a really good debate about the climate.
Exactly. Awesome.
So, yeah,
So
it seems wacky, but that's how the public debate kind of works.
And I remember I was in journalism school in the 80s, and there's a couple of things. It's like, of course, if it bleeds, it leads. And and I remember there was a cartoon that says, dog bites man is not news. Man bites dog is news. So it is, that is what the news is going to pick up. And that's why what Antonia is saying is so important. They're not going to pick up the positive things.
Pressure them. Republicans are constantly pressuring the news about what they cover. They go out and publicly accuse them of bias. They write letters. They harangue them all day long. It's not like just a letter to the editor. They write a letter to the editor saying, why aren't you covering this?
Exactly.
If we had our people on the ground, if we had our local Democratic organizers writing letters to MSNBC and saying, I need more climate legislation. I don't give a shit about what Ron DeSantis is doing. I want to hear about what we're doing about climate. I want you holding their feet to the fire about A, B, C, and D. They're susceptible to pressure.
Yeah.
So, but the thing is, they work the refs. They organize attacks against the press to get them to do what they want. And so, we can do it politely. We can say, we love you. We just really wish you would do this. But if we're their audience, they're going to listen to us. But we need to speak up about what we think is important and what we think that we should say it's important. You have a responsibility to educate the public. You should be doing this. And
you can contact them directly, or you can go online. I went on CBS's web, or their the Facebook page, I think it was, and they had posted a report they did with Frank Luntz, and they identified him as a CBS correspondent or something. And I pointed out, I go, well, what CBS calls a contributing a contributor, it's important for people to know that this is the guy who engineered the vision in this country with the GOPAC memo, working with Newt Gingrich, and that kind of divisive stuff ought to be at least identified by CBS, that this guy's the architect of this. And I don't know if it was my thing. Hopefully other people complained too, but they first started mentioning him as a Republican consultant, and now he's not even on there hardly ever see him. But it's good to complain, and you get a lot more mileage maybe in the local papers, but it's worth it.
Yeah, like I said, and everybody, it's after 8:30, so we need to wrap this up. And thank you everybody who stayed on this late till 8:30. It's awesome. I'm glad you were enjoying the content, and thank you to Antonia for providing all this wonderful content that we had tonight. I'll be sending out a recap. It'll have the chat, the video, and there's, by the way, tons of great stuff in the chat. So it's really well worth keeping.
That's really good.
All right. Thank you all. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
All right. Have a good one.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye. connectionslab.org